To be or not to be? That is the question by William Shakespeare. But what does this question mean to you? And who is this guy, William Shakespeare? Let's take a minute to watch a quick video on who William Shakespeare is. And as you are doing this, what I want you to think about is what is one important fact that you've learned about him, or what is something interesting that you've learned.
William Shakespeare, one of the greatest authors of all time, was born in Stratford-upon-Avon, England. His actual birth date is uncertain, but most scholars believe he was born on or near April 23rd, 1564.
We think he may have been educated in the King's School at Stratford because that would have been typical for a child with a father who was an alderman. What we do know is that he didn't go to university.
We have a marriage record for Shakespeare to Anne Hathaway in 1585. We also have baptism records for a daughter and a set of twins. And we also know that his son, Hamnet, one of the twins, died.
Shakespeare moved to London in the late 1580s. By the early 1590s, we know he's writing, and we know that he's acting.
By 1597, Shakespeare had authored 15 of the 37 plays attributed to him, including Romeo and Juliet, Comedy of Errors, and The Merry Wives of Windsor.
People think of William Shakespeare as an artist, a playwright. He was a pretty good businessman.
In 1599, he built the largest open-air amphitheater in London, the Globe Theatre.
He was an entrepreneur, he knew his market, he knew how to cater to that market, he made shrewd real estate investments.
Shakespeare's company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, changed its name to the King's Men when King James became its patron in 1603. This was a mark of exceptional prestige.
The different types of Shakespeare plays, they're separated into histories, comedies, tragedies, and then later on tragicomedies.
Shakespeare's phrases, the ways he used words, are so common that people often get mixed up and can't remember if they came from the Bible or from Shakespeare. My grandmother used to say, when something bad happened, that these were the slings and arrows of everyday life. She was not an educated woman, and she didn't go to Shakespeare plays. She didn't get that one from the Bible.
What scholars call Shakespeare's middle period, from 1595 to 1605, included such classic comedies as Midsummer Night's Dream, As You Like It, Twelfth Night, and Much Ado About Nothing. He also produced Hamlet, Othello, and Macbeth during this period.
Right at the cusp where Shakespeare begins to write Lear, it tips into what we could call the later Shakespeare. And this period produces Lear, Antony and Cleopatra, Tempest, Winter's Tale, Pericles, Cymbeline.
Shakespeare wrote great stories. For example, one of the stories starts with a king who is tired. He doesn't want to govern anymore, so he says to his three daughters, I'm going to separate the kingdom between the three of you, but it's going to be based on who tells me how much they love me. However much you love me, that's how much of the kingdom you're going to get. Now that's going to make me sit up. I mean, what a way to start a story. And that's King Lear.
Shakespeare was not only a playwright, he also was a poet, partly because of economic necessity. During the early 1590s, plague closed the theaters in London, and there was quite a vogue for producing sonnets.
Shakespeare wrote 154 sonnets, in addition to several narrative poems.
Shakespeare worked the English language, milked it for all it was worth, made up words if it didn't give him the right words. He is one of the first professional writers.
The details of William Shakespeare's death remain a mystery, but scholars believe he died on his birthday, April 23rd, 1616. In the 400 years since, Shakespeare's influence has only grown. His writing is the second most quoted after the Bible. He has been credited with introducing almost 3,000 words to the English language, and a Google search on Shakespeare returns more than 140 million results.
Shakespeare talked about the human condition. He explains to us how we think, how we feel, the human psyche. He eloquently explains it.
In the 18th century, questions arose about the authorship of Shakespeare's work, given the vague details we know of his life, his lack of higher education, and the similarity of his plays to others of the day. Today, most scholars believe Shakespeare wrote all his plays and sonnets.
I would argue that Shakespeare's legacy is the most influential figure in human civilization.
right, so let's go back and let's talk about some of the things that you should have heard or learned as you were watching this short clip. The early life of William Shakespeare. We don't exactly know his exact birth date, but we do know that he was baptized on April 26, 1954, and he was born in Stratford-upon-Avon. Most scholars do think, though, that he was born 3 days before his baptism on April 23, 1954. He did go to school and was educated, but he never attended a university. One thing that was really interesting, if you picked up on it, was he died on his birthday, April 23, 1616. Let's talk about Shakespeare's early family. His parents were John and Mary, and John worked many different jobs. He was a tradesman selling leather, goods, wool, malt, and corn, and he held many political stations in Stratford, once even as the mayor. His mother Mary was from an aristocratic farmer, so when John married her, he moved up on the social ladder. Their first 2 children were daughters, but unfortunately did not survive past infancy. William was their first child to survive. They later had 3 more boys and 2 more girls. One sister died at the age of 7. William met and fell in love with Anne Hathaway, and they had a fast courtship because Anne was 3 months pregnant with their first child. Notice she is 8 years older than William. Anne continued to live with the children in Stratford when Shakespeare moved to London. In Shakespeare's will, he left his second best bed to his wife, but left all of his money and property to his 2 surviving daughters and friends. Now, it sounds bad that he left his second best bed, but that actually was just a way to identify which bed she was supposed to take. Shakespeare and his wife had 3 children. Their first child was Susanna, and their second children were twins, Judith and Hamnet. Susanna and Judith both lived to adulthood and were married. Hamnet died when he was 11. There are no direct relatives of Shakespeare, as Susanna had 1 child and 1 grandchild, but the grandchild did not have any more children. Judith did have 3 sons. 1 died in infancy, and the other 2 died before they were married or had any other children. Shakespeare had many different works. He had 3 styles of plays that he would create: comedy, such as Much Ado About Nothing, or All's Well That Ends Well; history, such as Henry V; tragedy, Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, and Othello. Flags flew outside of the Globe Theatre to represent the play that would be performed. Comedy was white, history was red, and tragedy was black. Shakespeare was not just a writer, he was also a businessman, and he owned part of the Globe Theatre. Later, the company was named the King's Men, and the King's Men built the Big Globe Theatre. Shakespeare was also a master of words. In fact, he added over 3,000 words to the English language. Some words from Shakespeare were majestic, leapfrog, hint, lonely, excellent, gloomy. Common phrases such as catch cold, laugh it off, foregone conclusion, in a pickle, and wild goose chase. There was no spelling standards in the Elizabethan time, so people spelled their names however they wanted. 6 different documents exist with Shakespeare's signature, and they are all different. Scholars estimate that Shakespeare had 80 different ways to sign his name, and on the PowerPoint you can see 5 of those different ways. Most of Shakespeare's plays were performed at the Globe Theatre after 1599. It held between 2,500 and 3,000 people. There were no sceneries or sets, and actors wore their own clothes. Most theaters were built around roofless courtyards, so the plays were performed during the day. Poor were on the ground and exposed to all the elements of rain and sun. Rich were sat in the 3 galleries off the side. These were covered areas and more protected from the elements. Royalty generally sat on the 3rd level. Women were not allowed to act in this time period, so young boys between the ages of 11 and 14 played the roles of women. Crowds were allowed to interact with the performers, so they cheered them on and booed them when they thought it was bad. The actors did not receive the script until the play started. Shakespeare didn't want his plays stolen. Unfortunately, the Globe burnt down in 1613 due to a malfunction of one of the props, but it was quickly rebuilt in 1614. The Puritans, however, were against all entertainment and closed the theater in 1642, and they later destroyed the Globe Theater. What we're going to do is we're going to watch a couple of trailers, and I want you to think about how these trailers of these current movies match the plays that Shakespeare wrote so many years ago. And I want you to think about, of the three that we're going to watch, which one is most interesting to you that you would like to do more research on to figure out how does that current movie match Shakespeare's play that he had written. So the first one is 10 Things I Hate About You, which was Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew.
It's a widely known fact that the Stratford sisters aren't allowed to date.
For every girl who's ever hoped.
Daddy, as you know, it's the prom.
Every guy who's ever tried.
You never give up, do you?
Was that a yes?
No!
And anyone
You're concentrating awfully hard considering it's gym class.
who's ever been taken completely by surprise.
Not as vile as I thought you were.
10 Things I Hate About You.
Which one do you like better?
Rated PG-13. Starts March 31st.
West Side Story, The Sharks versus the Jets, is very similar to the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet, where you have the Montagues versus the Capulets. And we have The Lion King, which is very similar to Shakespeare's Hamlet.
Everything the light touches is our kingdom. But a king's time as ruler rises and falls like the sun. One day, the sun will set on my time here and will rise with you as the new king.